Who is qualified to teach Islam? Who speaks for Islam? Who are Islam's authorities? And how do we know? Can it be determined by how, with whom, or where a person studies? Is a particular form of credential or certificate required? Or are such considerations of little importance to the facts gleaned from Islamic sources? Orthodoxy and religious authority occupy significant space in sectarian debates in every major world religion. A similar dynamic can be found in non-religious circles. The tendency to measure the truth by men rather than to measure men by the truth has great allure to those who are insecure in their knowledge or faith or sense of ideological supremacy. According to the 8th century scholar Muhammad ibn Sirin, the first civil war prompted Muslims to demand a source for any teaching attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom God's blessing and peace. The spread of spurious information about the Prophet by unscrupulous persons with various agendas created the need to ensure that all such claims could be reliably traced back to him through an unbroken chain of trusted traditionists. This chain of traditionaries was called the isnad or sanad. It consisted of the names of narrators with whom the claimant had an encounter, which could be easily traced back to the Prophet through all intervening generations. Muhammad ibn Sirin said, quote, "The people did not ask for the isnad until political strife erupted. After that, the isnad of Hadith was demanded to discover who was either a proponent of the prophetic way so that his Hadith could be accepted, or a proponent of heresy so that his Hadith could be eschewed," unquote. The isnad became so integral to the identification with Sunni orthodoxy that another scholar, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, said, quote, "The isnad is part of the religion. Had it not been for the isnad, anyone would say whatever he wants," unquote. In this way, the isnad became the most decisive claim to religious authority among the Sunni majority. The allure of such power eventually attracted the Sufis. Sufis were largely treated as outcasts by the early traditionists. But to help overcome outcast status, the Sufis appropriated the concept of isnad from Hadith scholars and eventually introduced what they termed the isnad of discipleship and the isnad of personal consecration, tazkiyah and barakah. Such additions to the list of isnad types increased confusion about the true goal of the isnad system. The isnad was originally intended as a quality control mechanism for all information presumed to originate from the Prophet of Islam. Once the early Sunni traditionists abandoned the campaign to record and codify the prophetic tradition, the isnad's value would shift to the books where those traditions were compiled. So anyone who wanted an authentic version of the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, the Sahih of Imam Muslim, or that of any other hadith master would need to acquire it from a person who could source the books back to their original authors through a list of reliable traditionists. This likewise applied to all other written genres until the printing press, manuscript editing, and digitization seemingly reduced Muslim reliance on human carriers of prophetic knowledge. For what advantage does memorizing a text with an isnad have over a printed version of the same book if the printed work accurately mirrors the form and contents preserved in one's memory? Unless one can prove that what he knows with an isnad is quantitatively and/or qualitatively superior to the contents of a printed work, it would mean that isnad today has far more ceremonial value than it did in centuries past when it represented actual substance. To repeat, the true purpose of the isnad was to control the quality of information being ascribed to the Prophet. That notwithstanding, eagerness to be distinguished as qualified authorities of Islam led to another type of confusion. Today, many contemporary students of Islam mistakenly hold isnad to be synonymous with the traditional validating teaching certificate termed the ijazah. The ijazah has two basic connotations. The first, the ijazah of diraya, is issued to highlight a student's academic mastery or that a graduate has completed an intensive course of specialized study. The ijazah, or the other, the ijazah of riwayah, connotes permission to transmit information collected by one's teacher. Both the terms isnad and ijazah originate among early Muslim hadith scholars. The ijazah of riwayah was considered one of 8 primary ways of establishing a connection to a primary source of the prophetic teachings as detailed in books like Kitab al-Ilma' of Qadi Iyad and the Taqrib of Imam al-Nawawi. Sometimes a seeker might hear hadith directly from a primary human source, or the source may listen to a student repeat or read in the presence of the source what came to him about the prophet through the medium of that source. In some cases, the source might simply confirm that the information came through him. At other times, the source may further authorize the listener, reciter, or student to relate the information on the source's authority. When authorized, this was called ijazah. For most hadith scholars, a narrator did not require the permission of a source to narrate a hadith on his authority if the source confirmed that he was indeed the source. Some allowed it even if he did not confirm he was. And not all forms of ijazah were considered valid according to a few hadith scholars of note, like the literalist scholar Ibn Hazm. Listing the names of the scholars with whom one has studied and the book titles their teachers allegedly authorized them to teach has been fashionable for centuries. This took on a distinct character among Western students returning from study during the late 20th century. This was meant to bolster their authority and to specifically give them an edge over their ideological adversaries. While the focus on who rather than where or how one studied did reflect a return to earlier methods of knowledge authentication until the rise of the neo-traditionalist movement in the 1990s, most Muslims had become adjusted to the institution-based validation process pervasive in the Western universities. However, with the resurgence of private, non-institutional study, one could no longer simply say that he was a graduate of Al-Azhar, Medina University, or Al-Qarawiyyin. One would need to furnish a list of scholars, books, and ijazahs one received if he wanted to be presumed to have a correct understanding of Islam among neo-traditionalists. Notwithstanding the social political costs of these points of confusion, knowing who is or is not qualified to teach Islam is of enormous importance. However, it seems that even the ijazah of diraya was merely a convenience adopted to help the learned, or rather to help the unlearned, more easily identify those qualified, rather than a means of determining those whose views of Islam are within the parameters of orthodoxy. The 16th century polymath Jalaluddin as-Suyuti said, quote, "Ijazah from a sheikh is not a prerequisite for being allowed to impart knowledge and spread benefit. So anyone who knows of his own qualification may do so, even if no one authorizes him." This is the view of the early forebears and the pious ancestors. This likewise applies in every science, in imparting knowledge and issuing fatwa. This contravenes the view of the simple-minded, who imagine that to be a prerequisite. The only reason the scholars introduced ijazah was that entry-level learners and their like who desire to learn from another, in most cases, do not know the person's qualifications in light of their own inadequacy. And searching for qualification before taking instruction is a prerequisite. So ijazah was treated like a testimony of one's qualification from an authorized sheikh, unquote. What this quote teaches us is that the truth or accuracy of any given proposition or claim is not contingent upon the certificate or credential held by the claimant. This is equally if the credential is a PhD, MA, MD, JD, or ijazah. Truth is not weighed by men. Men are weighed by the truth. And the truth pursued through the isnad and ijazah of riwayah was the very definition of what Islam is and is not. All Muslims acknowledge that God ultimately determines what Islam is, as well as his messenger, peace be upon him, who speaks on his behalf.